Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the October meeting of the League of Women Voters. I want to call everyone's attention, first of all, to a meeting this coming Thursday evening, the 28th, which will be a discussion of redistricting in Carroll County. The meeting is by the Democratic Party, but it is an open meeting for everyone. And it will be at the American Pie Pizzeria on Maple Street. If you want to go eat, go at 6. If you want to just go to the meeting, go at 7. There are some figures that have been collected, particularly about the districts in the city of Carrollton, that are quite interesting. And I hope that some of you will be able to go and get this information. Other than that, tonight we welcome Dr. Heather Mbaye, who is going to speak to us about alternative election systems. You've got biographical information about her on your email inviting you to the meeting. So at this time, I will turn it over to Heather.
Thanks, Martha Ann. Hi, everyone, I'm Heather. So what I teach is comparative politics. And so we talk a lot in comparative politics about types of voting systems. It's sort of a standard lecture. And I'm giving you the 40-minute version of about 3 hour-long lectures. So if I go too quickly, hopefully this is a sort of informed audience, but there is some terminology I want to talk about first, just to make sure we're all sort of starting in the same place. First, there's single member districts and multiple member districts, and that makes a difference in how the voting systems work. So a single member district is essentially what we have in the United States. It's also used in Great Britain, and it's used pretty extensively in most of the former colonies of the United Kingdom. A multiple member district is exactly what it sounds like. And if you think of the Senate is sort of a multi-member district, although it's really only 2, it's for the entire state. And so some parliaments use multiple members in various districts however they're drawn, whether they're drawn by states or by local area or whatever. There's also first past the post versus proportional systems. Now, a first past the post is, again, what we have here. So it's pretty standard. Those can be either plurality or majority. And then you get a proportional system, which is more proportional, but they don't work well in single member districts. So you get sort of a different kind of thing going. Majority means 50% plus 1. So what we have in the United States is a plurality system in a first past the post single member district. So whoever gets the most votes wins the entire district. Mixed systems can take advantages of both, and I will get to a mixed system at the end, which is my favorite one. So single member districts, first past the post is the most common. It's used again in the USA, UK, many former colonies. The advantage of this one is that it provides a clear-cut choice. It's sort of A, B, C, or D. It leads. Okay. Sorry? Somebody, wasn't sure if that was a question or if it was just an accident. It leads to a 2-party domination. That's called Duverges Law, which is about the closest thing we have to a law in political science. Duverges Law essentially states that if you have a plurality first past the post kind of system, it leads to 2 big parties kind of dominating the entire thing. So if you want to try for other parties to get a chance to get their foot in the door, smaller parties or third parties, then this system is very difficult for those. And that has been shown to be the case in just about every single one of these systems that uses it across the world. This can be exclusionary to minority views. And I don't mean racial minorities necessarily. I just mean, it's hard for the Socialist Party to get in. It's hard for the Green Party. It's hard for more conservative parties. They're all kind of excluded here. This can lead to people being disaffected. I think the big systems don't support them, and they kind of turn off from politics. So that's definitely happening. It's also, we see the result is also that this sort of system excludes women from being elected, because women are not seen as broad appeal. They're seen as representing a special interest, which I think is particularly interesting maybe to this group. It's harder for women to be elected in a first past the post system, and you get more women in government if you don't have this kind of system in a single member district. It also relies very heavily on districting.
I can't.
Okay, someone keeps unmuting and talking. So
Yes, please, if you can mute everyone except for Dr. Mbaye, please keep yourselves muted.
I keep muting this person and they keep unmuting. So that is unfortunate. So this can lead to it relies very heavily on the districting. And so gerrymandering becomes a political tool of both parties. It happens in the United States on both sides. Multiple member districts, for the most part, multiple member districts are fairly rare. And they often use something called block voting, which is essentially, okay. Happened again.
That's Rosemary. Can anybody block Rosemary?
Well, I can mute her, but it's every, minute it's happening and throwing my flow off. So, it's, I don't know what is getting bumped on her end, but so multiple member districts, again, are pretty rare and mostly abandoned. They can create some serious disproportionality. For example, this was used in Mauritius in the 1980s, and it led to the party in opposition got elected, which happens a lot. It kind of flips back and forth between the two major parties a lot of times. But essentially, the party in opposition won every single seat in the legislature because of block voting, which is essentially that one person, if there's 5 seats in their district, they cast all 5 votes for candidates of that same party. And so with only 64% of the vote overall, they won every single seat in the legislature, which was not very good in terms of proportionate and cooperation and all the things that we like in a democracy. So there's also a variation of this called a party block vote, where you don't vote for candidates, but you vote for a party, which is even worse when you don't have candidates on it. Then you get majority systems, which I think are interesting. These are used, for example, in the parliament in Australia. This is sometimes called an alternative vote or a preferential vote. And in this particular system, you have to have a majority to win. It can't just be a plurality. So there's a couple of ways that this can work. One advantage, first of all, there's the alternative vote or preferential vote. And the one advantage of this is that it enables the vote of candidates to accumulate, so that diverse interests can kind of be combined. So candidates have to appeal to multiple groups of voters. This is essentially, you get a list of candidates for your seat, for your district, and you rank them 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or however many there are. In some systems, you're required to vote for every single one. So you have to rank everybody. And in some, you just rank the however many you like. So it kind of depends on how the rules are. This is, it enables the supporters of candidates who probably won't get elected to have some influence. So if you prefer a candidate that's not very popular in the general population, but that the other candidates then have to appeal to the voters of your candidate, including you, to get to be number 2. Because what happens in an alternative vote system is anybody who doesn't, so how do I explain this? Okay, I'm going to back up a little bit. You vote your list 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, let's say. Your candidate number 1 is candidate A, but candidate A only gets 5% of the total vote. So candidate A is eliminated because you have to get at least 50%. So they start with candidate A, he got the least number of votes, and they distribute all of his votes to the second candidate on the list. So then candidate number 2 for me might have been somebody who's got 45%, but that candidate doesn't quite get to 50 with the redistribution of those 5% because not everybody voted for that person for number 2. So then we go down to the person who got the second highest number of votes, and we eliminate them, and all of their second votes get cast, and sometimes it's their third. This is a complicated system to count, which is the big disadvantage of it. One of the biggest problems is that it requires a reasonable degree of literacy and numeracy. You have to send all the votes, can't be counted. There would be no counting in Carroll County if we did this. It would have to go to a central place where this could be counted very carefully, and it takes a long time to count, which is not popular in the United States. We like an instant result. We want to know right now. So I'm not sure that this would ever be super popular. This is a method of voting, though, that I often use in small groups, particularly if we have multiple opinions about candidates, or if, for example, we're hiring somebody new and we've interviewed 3 people, then we might rank all 3. And it's a way to kind of get to a consensus without just eliminating one off the top. It can, it's the best system for promoting centrist politics because it promotes candidates to kind of be, they want to be appealing to a lot of groups, and it helps those marginal views to be taken into account by the bigger candidates because they have to appeal to them to get to be number 2 or number 3 on their list. There's also something called a 2-round system, which is a little bit easier to deal with and eliminates some of the issues of the instant vote. This is used, for example, in presidential elections in France. So essentially, you might have 5 or 6 candidates running. There's always one from the big center right party. There's one from the big center left party. Then there's a couple from the far left parties and a couple from the far right parties. It's pretty much the same every time. But sometimes it can be 2 candidates from one of the same big centrist parties. Maybe they just both are, really popular in the party. But essentially what happens in the French system is that they run 2 elections about 4 weeks apart. And the first round, literally is called a first round, they take the top 2 vote getters from that and they have a runoff. So we're familiar with runoffs here and it works exactly the same way. But that second round is not a runoff election. It's still part of the same election. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a runoff between the big center right and the big center left. And in one case, in the last election in France, I think it was the last one, the 2 biggest vote getters were the center right party and one from the far right sort of neo-Nazi party, Nationalist Front, which was really unfortunate because it meant that literally everybody who was not a person of that party voted for the current president of France, who is not particularly popular. The National Front Party vote in the first round was a protest vote, interestingly. So people wanted to vote for this person to prove a point, and the point they proved was that the 2-round system meant that the center right party got all the votes then. So that's a problem. It's significantly more expensive because it is essentially running 2 rounds of elections in the entire country at once. It can lead to terrible disproportionality. And so it is not a system that is particularly perfect. It does not work particularly well in France. But then I'm not sure that our single round first past the post works any better. So I'm not sure this would be the one to switch to. It's significantly more expensive and doesn't really change any of our other issues. Then there are proportional systems, and the rationale that underpins a proportional representation system is that it is consciously reducing disparity between a party's share of the national vote and its share of parliamentary seats. So essentially, if a party wins 40% of the vote, it should have 40% of the seats. If 50% of the public supports the party, it should have 50% of the seats, not 80% or whatever. It should be pretty close to the real representation of what the popular opinion of the party is. Proportional representation requires the use of electoral districts with more than one member. You cannot have a part of one seat. So single member districts kind of get thrown out here. And there are two different types of proportional representation systems. One is the list PR, which is essentially a party list. So there's a party list, and the party publishes that list ahead of time. So you know, oh, sorry. So you know, that's Loki. He always thinks that the Zoom meeting is for him. You always know who those candidates are going to be. So if there are 100 seats in the legislature, they're going to give you a list of 100 names. Essentially, they're saying, if we win 100 seats, we're going to fill every single seat with these people in order. And if we win 40 seats, it'll be the top 40 of them, and et cetera. So people know that ahead of time, and then they cast their vote for a party. And whatever the proportion is of the national legislature, whatever the proportion of the national vote is, that's how many seats they get, and they fill them from the party list. There's also a system called single transferable vote, which I'm going to talk about because this one gets thrown out, I think, quite a lot. So single transferable vote. This is where voters rank order their candidates in multiple member districts again. So this is similar to the one I talked about before, but it's a multiple member district. Single transferable vote has been advocated by political scientists as one of the most attractive electoral systems, but it has been limited in its use. So we don't have a lot of examples of this. It has been used in the Republic of Ireland since the 20s, Malta since 1947, elections in several Australian states, which are roughly equivalent to ours, and for many European Parliament elections. The single transferable vote uses multiple member district, and the voters rank candidates, again, in order of preference. But the math gets really complicated here, and I'm not going to try to explain it. What happens is there's a quota. It's a certain number of quotas, the votes, the number of votes cast divided by the number of seats plus one. And so it's a mathematical selection. So any candidate, so we're not voting for parties here, we're voting for candidates. Any candidates that meets the quota automatically is elected up to however many number, right? So if there's 100 seats and 50 of them get elected outright and meet the quota outright, that's great. Then you start eliminating candidates from the bottom up. And again, this gets complicated on the math. The result is a series of rounds of counting, which is going to take a while and can get kind of complicated. And then sometimes the votes above the quota are redistributed also. So it gets even more complicated. I mean, I don't know if any of you, probably a lot of you actually have worked in our vote count, but I can't imagine running elections the way we run them in this country and using a system like this that is this complicated to count when it's as controversial just to count straight votes as it currently is, if that makes sense to everyone. Again, I am not a mathematician. I do statistics, but not math. And so explaining the math here is a little bit complicated, but I could try to go through it, but instead I want to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of this. The single transferable vote is probably the most sophisticated of the electoral systems because it allows for a choice between parties and between candidates. So you can pick you kind of pick a party, but you can also pick candidates within that list, which I think is a good thing because we want to have a a connection with our representative. I think that's important. The final results tend to be fairly proportional to the actual outcomes, and the fact that most actual examples of are relatively small. The Republic of Ireland is really quite small, and so it's a lot easier to count. With a country the size of the United States, I'm not sure it's a practical solution. It has a better chance for the election of independent candidates because you don't have to be backed by a party. It can just be a popular local official or whatever. It's easier for them to be elected. The disadvantage, preference voting is complicated, but also the counting is incredibly complicated. Estonia used it once and said, this is too complicated, we're not even going to try. And Estonia is, again, quite a small country. They've literally said, we can't, it's too complicated to count, it takes too long, we're not doing it anymore. It can at times produce fragmentation within political parties. So that can be a problem because parties need to be kind of a minimum size. We don't want too much fragmentation in political parties, or you get a situation like you get in the Weimar Republic where there were 100 parties in the legislature and nothing could get done. And Hitler rose. And that's a part of it. So we don't want too much of that. And we also don't want clientelistic kind of results. I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, a local independent can get elected. And I think it's another thing to, you can get some clientelism where a local person is very popular because there's lots of kickbacks and other kinds of corruption that they become popular through those means. It can also sometimes lead to some odd results in terms of parties that receive, for example, you might receive 33% of the vote, but because of how the seats get determined, you may not only have 20 seats in the legislature. And so it can actually fragment the results more than the proportion of the population. So because of the mathematical method that's used. My favorite, in the interest of all transparency, is the German mixed member proportional system. So this is my favorite. Under mixed member proportional, and there's also parallel, which we kind of talk about the difference of that in a few minutes. The proportional seats are awarded to compensate for any disproportionality produced by the district seat results. For example, if one party wins 10% of the vote nationally, but no district seats, then it'll be rewarded enough seats to bring its representation up. So what essentially happens is this: half the seats, usually half the seats, whatever the number is, are determined in single member first past the post elections in individual districts across the whole country. The other half of the seats of the legislature are essentially essentially filled from party lists based on the proportional results. So everybody's in a district, everybody has some candidate that they voted for, or in some case didn't vote for, who is their representative, but there's also overall a proportional number of seats. I want to share my screen for just a second. I got to open up the file so you can see what I'm talking about. I always have to sort of do this in class as well. All right, so what you can see is a pretend election in Germany. It's not a real one because we're not using, they have 598 members of the Bundestag. I'm not going to try to do that math here. So let's pretend that there's 100 members because that's much easier math, particularly when we're using percentages. So we see the total overall seats would be 100. Total overall seats is over here. In the first round of elections, in Germany, there's literally, they call it a 2-ballot system, but it's literally the front and the back of the same page. So on the front, it's an election for a specific candidate for their specific district. And half of the seats are awarded through these district ballots. So that's this number here. So that's half of our fictionalized Bundestag of 100 seats. The CDU, which is the Christian Democratic Union, the Christian Socialist Union, is the center-right party of Germany. It is consistently one of the bigger parties. So let's say, for the purposes of our example, that they win 22 of these districts outright. The SPD is the Social Democratic Party of Germany, and it won about 18, which is also fairly consistent with what happens in a real election. The Free Democratic Party, Free Democrats are they're still relatively centrist, but they're further right than the CDU, that say they win about 6 seats. And then the Green Party wins about 4, which is the same as the Green Party here. So that's our 50 seats in the first one, and that's kind of what you would expect to see. But then the second half of the seats are determined by this. So you turn your ballot over and you vote for the party. So CDU, SPD, FPD, Greens, and then a bunch of other parties. Sometimes some of their names are very funny and they only stick around for one election, but you can vote for them if you want to. In Germany, you have to get at least 5% of the national vote to get any seats at all, because they know what happens when you have too much fragmentation in your legislature. And that is what happened in the Reichstag during the Weimar Republic. So they don't want to go there. So they've said you have to have at least 15%. So we're going to take the top 4 parties and assign them a fictional percentage. So let's say the CDU gets 32%, the SPD 28%, the FPD 25%, and the Greens 15%. And that total is, let's see if I can get to my data. Where's my sum? Hold on. Here it is. So that's our total proportion. This is a percentage of the national vote on that second ballot, which is the backside of the first half. So the total seats that a party should have based on the proportion is 32. The total seats the SPD should have is 28, the FPD 25, and the Green 15. But the CDU has 22 and they need 32, so they get 10 from the second 50 that we're distributing. The SPD also gets 10 because that brings them up to their percentage. The FDP, though, is popular, but it's hard for it to win any particular set of elections. So it gets 19 seats in this second round, and the Greens get 11. So that's where we distribute our second 50 seats. And then the total seats the party should have is relatively proportional to the national vote, but you still have single member districts where people can be attached to a particular candidate. So voters, they make 2 separate choices. Usually in New Zealand and Germany, that's the way they do it. They have the 2 ballot system. There are a couple of places where they basically just take the overall percentage of seats. They just sort of count up all the single member districts and see what the overall proportions were. But that's has not been as successful. The proportion of seats allocated varies, but usually it's that you have to win at least, a minimum number. You can't just be, I think in Britain one time, there's a party called, there's the people who go to the pub party and all kinds of, you can't just be a tiny little, we like the quick Carrollton Square party or something like that and get elected. You have to actually, have some broad appeal. And so for the most part, you get some of the benefits of having a single member first past the post system, but you avoid some of the worst problems of some of the proportional systems, it being overly controlled by the party and sort of disconnected from the voters. or at least perceived as disconnected from the voters. It's also possible, what if the CDU won, say they won 48 of those 50 seats, but they were only supposed to have 32. Well, sometimes in Germany, when they have an election, they have extra seats. So instead of 598 seats in the legislature, they just have 606 or 608 or whatever. And that seems to not be a problem for them. So I'm not sure how we would handle it, but they just sort of add those in. So if you want to talk more about the German system, there you go. I kind of rushed through some of this and I apologize for that. But there are lots of electoral systems. They all have some disadvantages, and I'm not sure what would be better than what we have now. What we have now works pretty well for the most part. But there you go. So does anyone have any questions? Also, let's see if I can see my view, see everybody. There's everybody. So you can see one of my cats over my shoulder. It's her dinner time, so she always hovers when it's time for dinner.
This is the first time I've known there were that many different systems.
And these are just the major ones. There's so many, and they just, people want to try to make it better. And so some of them get really complicated and they're difficult on the math side. But yeah, there's a ton, but these are the most common ones, at least that I talk about in Western Europe and Intro to Comparative. Hey, Paul, haven't seen you in about 5 years.
I have a question for you.
Okay, I don't know if I can answer it, but I'll try.
A concern that I have, because I guess I'm not so sure our system is working so well. And like, I'm not the only one who kind of thinks we might be drifting into more of a totalitarian society. And I recently read an interview with Andrew Yang. He was thinking that you remember that name. He's also thinking along that lines, that authoritarianism is on the rise. And he would like to head that off. And he thinks that we could make some modification in our voting systems that are feasible. Yeah, I don't think we could go to a German system. That's not going to happen here. But kind of building on what we've got, some changes might make us basically more of a better democracy. And so I guess I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Yeah, because if we can't go to a German system, which is your favorite, but there are certain things that possibly might improve things in the States. Do you have any ideas on changes in our electoral system?
I think that the issues we have are not necessarily problems of the first past the post single member district electoral system. I think that, and this is just my opinion, but maybe others would agree. I think one of the biggest problems we have is that whoever spends the most money wins. And that's pretty true across the board. And if we limited if there was campaign finance reform, that would help a lot. That is one of the things they do in Britain that is different than they do here. That is to say that there's a certain amount of spending you can do and it's pretty low. And once you've met that, you're done. And you can't buy TV commercials. You can't buy newspaper advertisements. And so I was actually in the UK, went during part of the last election, and they actually did a TV special one night where they gave equal time to all the parties, and they went through what their platforms were and who their major candidate for prime minister would be, and all of that. So they also have first past the post single member districts. but you can't buy TV time. You get TV time awarded to you based on how much support you had in the last election. So it's not just the pub drinkers party is not on there with equal time to the Tories, but there is a certain limitation to how much you can spend. You can't buy your way in, which I think is our biggest problem we have. And the second problem is we had a lot of protections against populism when we wrote our Constitution, and we got rid of all of them except the Electoral College. And because we got rid of all the others, this one has become a problem. And somebody in the direct message said, how would I define the Electoral College? And I would define it as a problem, because it prevents the direct election of the president. And it was done because a lot of people who were going to vote were illiterate, and the elites thought that they were unable to make a coherent decision. That's why they created it. And some people may say that we're still in that situation, but we've gotten rid of the other protections against the worst ills of populism. And now the Electoral College is essentially being used as a tool of populism because it's a first past the post kind of system. If we distributed our Electoral College votes proportionally to what, instead of, winner takes the whole state, might be a different situation. I don't know what Andrew has proposed, Andrew Yang.
Well, the kind of thing you're talking about in terms of those would be things. I'll just toss out two more, see how you would respond to them. And these are things which do exist in states, so they're not so far-fetched. No. Like open primaries and then ranked voting.
Open primaries might help. The problem with primaries is that people don't vote in them. So I'm not sure opening them would the vote is so small, and the people who vote in primaries tend to be the party faithful. So we tend to pick, those of us who vote in primaries, myself included, tend to not pick the most centrist of candidates, which makes the candidates we pick in our primaries more difficult to sell in a general election. And so we pick candidates sometimes that are more in the extreme wings of the party than the central wings, because the people who tend to vote tend to be the ones who are like, hardcore. That what we used to call a yellow dog Democrat, like my mom was, she literally would have rather voted for a yellow dog than a Republican, which I think is very funny. The first time I voted for a Republican, I think she almost had a heart attack, but I think there are problems with primaries that I'm not sure an open primary would solve, unless we were almost doing it, because there's also strategic things people do when it's an open primary, like they don't care which of their candidates win, but they'll go pick the craziest one of the other party in the hopes that you get a situation like the second round of the election in France, where you have a center right and a far right in the second round of the presidential election, and then it's just a landslide for the center right. So I don't know how that would work. I've never sat down and thought about how it would work in the US with our primary system. The primaries, to me, the biggest problem is we don't all vote in them, just like we don't vote in local elections, which is also a problem, because this is where our vote matters the most.
What about ranked voting? You seem to like
I like ranked voting because it does tend to push the big parties toward the center, in the sense that they have to make a broad appeal, but also it can force them to take into consideration the views of smaller parties or factions within the party. so that because the big candidates, the big centrist candidates want to be the second choice of the small parties, wherever they are, whether they are centrist small parties, or whether they are far left or far right small parties. They try to be, those candidates try to take those views into account more often. The only problem with ranked voting is that it is harder to count. And can you imagine the lawsuits? But, you know, we dealt with the ones we had here, so I feel like we could deal with that. But it is harder to count those because you have to know how to redistribute the second candidate vote. But it's not impossible. And I've done it quite a few times with other organizations that I'm in where we were having elections, and I was like, let's just do ranked voting. So it is an easy one, but it's easier when the district is small and it's not, 8 million people or whatever. It gets a little more complicated at that stage. It would, though, it tends to the election of more of less of those far left or far right or extreme party candidates, and tends to force us to choose candidates that are more in the center. Maybe also we could, if we had ranked choice voting, we could just put everybody in all one group and not have primaries. Just vote once. It's an idea. Because again, the problem with primaries is people don't vote in them. They just don't show up. So, and I see that in Carroll County. There have been some elections here where I showed up at my polling place on the day and I was like the third person they'd seen all day. So they're usually like, oh, we have a, and there's all this kind of fluttering around trying to find the forms. And I think, geez, okay, but I vote every single time. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Does anybody else want any more of my rambling opinions? I feel like I just ramble a lot about it, but it is an interesting thought experiment. What would make things better here?
Do any of the rest of you have a question? Well, if not, Heather, we thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. I do appreciate it. And I apologize for last month. I did not expect to end up in the ER, where I have never gone in my life. So the night before this, it was a scary thing. So, but I'm okay now.
We're glad you got right out of it.
Yes, me too. Yep.
All right, Gila, are you ready to cut us off?
Whenever you tell me.
I guess it's now.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot.